So now I'm going to pass over to Noel, who's going to introduce our guest this evening, or this morning.
This morning in San Francisco. So welcome to Judith Taylor, who's been telling us about how she lives right up in the Pacific Heights, San Francisco, which is one of those places I think where a lot of us would like to live.
Yeah, not jealous at all.
Not jealous at all. No. We've got Judith because she's bringing a book out on the history of women in gardening, and in fact, this is part of a whole. She's been quite a prolific writer on garden history, but in fact, this is absolutely not her career. So I think Judith would like to hear really about perhaps what your day job used to be, and then how you got into this very, very different world of plants and gardening, and in particular, your wonderful bent for researching and writing about garden history.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great deal of pleasure to be here and participate in this event. Yes, you are correct. I studied medicine at Oxford and practiced neurology for a number of years. Came over to this country and became active in American life. And I have always been very interested in history, and particularly the history of medicine. And for centuries, the history of medicine was basically the history of botany. Until 1899, when aspirin was first synthesized, the first chemically laboratory-built painkiller, aspirin, all medicines were essentially from the garden, from botany. And so the history of medicine, the history of botany fused in my mind, and I began to do small bits of research and start writing short stuff, which really just sort of covered both those fields. Once I came to live in San Francisco, I had learned that you must never retire. Retiring is the kiss of death. You take up something new and difficult for those final years of your life. And so I decided to look into the history of gardens and plants. We had bought a house in Marin County, which is just over the bridge from San Francisco, and planted a garden. Because this is a Mediterranean climate, we planted a lot of olive trees. And I don't know about you, but I think the olive tree is a very beautiful thing. So I rushed off to the library to find a book. There were no books. The bookshops had nothing. So what do you do in that situation? You write your own book. And that's really what got me started.
Fantastic.
Right. So yes, so that's always a good way isn't it? I mean, I've had that experience as well, looking for something and realizing it's not there, thinking, well, maybe I better write it, and 10 years later. So could you tell us about what you in fact have published so far?
Well, if you've got time. The
Quick summary.
First book was The Olive in California, History of an Immigrant Tree. Second book was Tangible Memories, Californians and Their Gardens, 1800 to 1950. Third one was The Global Migrations of Ornamental Plants, How the World Got into Your Garden. Then I moved into the topic which really engaged me for the rest of my activities. That is flower breeding. When you go into Sainsbury's or, look in any unimportant sort of shop, they've very often got those big buckets with gladioli and carnations and snapdragons and lilies. How did all that happen? That's what really intrigues me, is looking behind the curtain. Who did all that? That didn't happen by chance. Those are not species plants, most of them. They're hybrids. Who made the hybrids? Anyway, so I wrote a book called Visions of Loveliness, Great Flower Breeders of the Past. And I took, a lot of trouble, and it was a wonderful pleasure to revive memories of people who had once been very well known, but had been completely forgotten. And that covered, I think, 18 genera. And then I wrote the next one, called An Abundance of Flowers, which included another 8 genera. So those 2 books were sort of a little contribution, in my opinion, to an important subject. And by the way, no one else has written those on that subject for many, many years. And that's what Noel picked up on when he reviewed them for me in the Royal Horticultural, in the garden. And then after that, let me think where I've been. There's number 5, 6, and 7.
You did one on East Germany, didn't you?
Yes, that's the next one. That arose because while I was doing the research for those other 2 books on breeders, a fair number of those people turned out to be behind the Iron Curtain. You know, I read these books a number of years ago when there still was an Iron Curtain, or at least it had only very, very recently been breached. And I thought that was a fascinating possibility to look. For example, did you know that the epicenter of clematis breeding is Estonia? Anyway, so I sort of made a note of all these guys and then decided I would write that book. It's a niche within a niche. I understood that. I knew it was never going to sell, but I wanted to get that information in one place and have it out there, regardless of whether or not it would become a popular. So that's what I did. I ended up only East Germany cooperated with me. Interestingly, I tried to get information out of the other Eastern Bloc countries and nobody responded. I even asked them to write the notes in German for me. I thought they couldn't read English. But
we had a wonderful interview with Janis Ruksans from Latvia about 3 years ago, and so we heard quite a bit from him. I mean, Latvia was the Holland of the Soviet Union in terms of plant production, and Janis is I mean, he's an amazing character. I mean, one of the most extraordinary people we've ever interviewed on this. You know, a politician and but who had a very successful career growing plants, and I've we've certainly spoken to other people, and I know there's an awful lot happened in Poland, and those sort of close personal collections there with people who. But anyway, I think there's I agree with it. So it's a fascinating topic. But let's move on to women and gardens, which has just been brought out by Women and Gardens from the Victorian Age to Today, University of New Mexico Press. How did this book come about?
My friend Peter Stansky at Stanford University, the emeritus professor of history, had a close friend, Susan Bell. After she died, he was going through her papers and he found a very sketchy outline for a book that she had hoped to write. And I'm talking 1976, 50 years ago, about women and gardens. And he thought that this was an interesting topic. And he came to me and he said, "Why don't you write this book?" And I said, "Fine, be happy to do it." So that's where it came from. I had already been very interested. For a long time, all my other work was collecting the name of women who bred flowers. They are a very, very small subset of these guys. But they're very interesting to me because that is the, male preserve beyond Marcher.
Yes.
One such woman who worked very successfully for many years for a very big seed house told me that when she got her PhD, she was really raring to go, and she was interviewed by some official at one of these big seed houses, and he looked at her and he said to her, "Don't bother, McDonald's is hiring."
That's terrible. That's terrible.
So you can see what they were up against. That's why
yes.
I'm very interested in them, because they overcome enormous odds.
Yes. No, I mean, you probably know the book, but I wrote this book on the history of crop breeding. I mean, essentially agricultural genetics, and they were absolutely all men. I mean, in the end, I ended up doing sort of half a chapter on Barbara McClintock, the geneticist, simply because, although she wasn't a plant breeder, what she did was very important in terms of maize genetics. But I felt I had to drag her into the book because it was just so male dominated. I mean, I've done since then, it's changed a lot, but
the same is true. Women are not in wheat, rice, or maize breeding. They are in ornamental breeding and some vegetable breeding. They're still not allowed into the major crops. But I digress.
Anyway, so I think you've got a presentation about your book, haven't you? So let's have that.
There's a picture of the jacket And I want to spend a couple of seconds on that because I'm very fascinated with it. The lady in the garden is Celia Thaxter. In her day, and I'm talking about the early 20th century, she was a very well-known poetess. You hear me, poetess. That's what they called her. But the most important thing, in my opinion, and for this purpose, is that she ran a hotel on a Maine island, out just a few miles off the coast of Maine, Appledore Island. She had a hotel which was frequented every summer by the cream of New England intellectuals, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Emerson, and all those guys would spend a few weeks in Mrs. Thaxter's hotel. Because she was responsible for the hotel and was very conscientious, she planted a huge garden, a very, very big garden. All the information remains. We still have her lists and so forth. And she needed armfuls of cut flowers for her hotel, for the lobby, for the restaurant, blah, blah. And there was an interesting American painter of the time, very prominent in his day, Charles Hassan, who also spent his summers there. And he loved to paint her garden. And this is one of his pictures. So I think the cover is interesting and the backstory behind it is important. She epitomizes a lot of what we're talking about today. Here she is. Nice Victorian lady. Now, I'm going to spend most of my time telling you stories about wonderful women of all kinds, but we do have to do a little bit of academic work at the beginning to set the scene. Women and gardens, according to some people, have a sort of mysterious affinity, rather like women and babies. You know, it's given that women and gardens go together. But 50 years of feminist research and theory have taught us that we have to distinguish between what is culturally derived and what is innate through either genetics or early experiences. Now, women were, in fact, very valuable, very important for gardening. I'm talking about pre-Norman days in England, for example. And right now, in most of the world, in poor countries, if women don't plant a garden and plant rice and vegetables, they don't eat. So we're talking probably 50% of the world's population. And when Susan had the idea about women and gardens, that was not on her mind. She was still at an era before that sort of thing was becoming noticed. She knew exactly who she had in mind, and she didn't have to say it because she knew that her audience would accept that as well. Middle class, upper middle class, prosperous women who had had no reason to do hard physical work to survive did it because they wanted to do it, because it gave them pleasure. It was very important in their lives. So we narrowed down who we're talking about in this book primarily. And I pay obeisance to all the official politically correct notions about who women are and so forth. But primarily, we're really talking about a subset of women. And initially, once we get past the Saxon era and into the Norman era, you're talking about women of substance, proprietors of castles, and so forth. And that brings us now to one of these very fascinating gardens in 16th century France. Many, many visitors every year. And it's notable because it has 2, even 3 gardens attached to it. A great chateau, which was owned by the then King of France, Henry II, and he gave it to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. And the first thing she did was she laid out this beautiful garden. And it's in that old style, meant to be seen from the second floor of your house, looking down so that it looked like a piece of tapestry. That was the idea back then. The garden had to look like an artificial textile rather than be a piece of nature. Well, everything was going along swimmingly until poor old Henry died. And then his widow, Catherine de' Medici, not surprisingly somewhat vengeful, threw Diane de Poitiers out of that castle. Too sweet. And then Catherine de' Medici planted her own garden. So it's of some significance historically. I'm going to fast forward. We can't go on forever with all this stuff. Lady Mary Mertley Montagu was a very interesting English woman. She was very, very well educated for her time. And she was married to the English ambassador to what was called the Porte, that is the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, or then Constantinople. Lady Mary had a very open mind. She was unusual for her age and her aristocratic upbringing. She liked to talk to all kinds of people. And when she got to Constantinople, she noticed that many, many women whom she met in harems had perfect skin, whereas back in Europe, hundreds, thousands of women's skin had been ravaged by the smallpox. She used to be remembered and revered for having made that marvelous observation. And she inquired, and she found out that they did what was called variolation. And she found that they take a tiny bit of the pus from a active smallpox lesion and inject it into the skin of a healthy person. That would protect them. So she's very important. She made a major medical discovery, and she publicized it. She did it to her own children, and she started a very important move. These two ladies, called the Ladies of Llangollen, were known because they had a really beautiful garden on the island of Anglesey, which is just off the coast of Wales. They attracted a great deal of very prurient attention because they were two women living together as a married couple, which was just not the done thing in the 1800s. But they were noted for their garden and wonderful diaries and notes they kept about their garden activities. Here's a familiar name, William Wordsworth's sister. Now we'll be starting to see what has always been known is that women have always lived in the shadow of famous men, and she's no exception. She lived with him even after he got married, but she was noted. She kept beautiful diaries of what she grew in her garden, and she did her writing. She wrote diaries and journals and small stuff. She built a little gazebo type, she called it a shed, but it was a bit more than a shed, in her garden, and she sat there and did her writing. And we have the records of what she grew, and so it's of considerable interest and importance. This woman is very striking. She was born into a wealthy family, but then her father lost his money, Jane Webb. And back in those days, very frequently, a woman who was left like that, bereft, would turn to writing novels as a way of making a living. And she wrote a book which was published around 1820 or something called The Mummy. And it was set in the future in the year 2000. And she was writing what was perfect science fiction fantasy. She even came up with the thought of some form of communication which resembles the internet. There was a very, very prominent English horticulturist of that period called John Loudon, and he eventually dominated the horticultural scene. And when she married him, he taught her a great deal, and then she began to write books of gardening for ladies. So we're coming up now. You see, it's moving ahead. There's another familiar name you might not associate with gardens. She was the only daughter of a really mean, classic Victorian patriarchal household. You know, she lit her father's pipe, she fetched his slippers, blah, blah. But she happened to be very good at drawing, and she loved nature. And they spent their summers on a country area up in Yorkshire, where she made very interesting observations about plant life around her. She in particular noticed that lichens were a mixture of fungi and another organism. Mine is not clear at the moment, but anyway, and she drew painstaking pictures exactly of what it was. And she wrote a paper which she had thought could be presented at the Linnean Society. That's an old English horticultural society associated with very important people. But women were not invited. She had an uncle who was a member, and he undertook to present it, but that was delayed. And by the time he got round to presenting Beatrix's work, she had moved on to the work which we now know her for. But she was a very early pioneer of women's activities in the garden. This woman is probably the queen of all women gardeners. I think many of you who are, if you're interested enough to come to this talk, you will have heard of Gertrude Jekyll. If you haven't heard of Gertrude Jekyll, you may know the rose, which was named for her, a very beautiful dark pink rose, which many people grow. Even here in San Francisco, I have friends who grow it. Gertrude Jekyll was a very, very unusual woman and had a very unusual life. She was born into a military family. Her father was a captain or a major. But when she was quite young, he decided to retire from that life and take up his hobby, which was metalworking. And he built a very efficient workshop in their garden. They lived in London for a while, then they moved down to Surrey. And he had 3 or 4 sons who did whatever they did, but the little girl, Gertrude, kind of dogged him. And he taught her to do metalwork at the same level of skill as he did himself. And she got from that the notion that if you're going to do something, you have to do it properly. She was very artistic. She loved sewing and embroidery. She loved painting. And she did something which was unusual in those days, in the 1860s. Her father allowed her to do it. She attended an art college. When the Great Exhibition of 1851 was taken down, Prince Albert had arranged that that area, which became known as Exhibition Road, should house advanced institutions of learning. One of them was an Academy of Art. And so Gertrude attended the Academy of Art, where she was introduced to the color theories of that period. And the very important finding by a man called Choiseul, a French artist, that a color looked different depending on where it was placed, what color was put next to it. She graduated from the college, but then found that a lot of sewing and so forth was too stressful on her eyes, and she decided to take her theories into the garden. And she developed borders and patterns of color and wrote extensively about them. She worked with William Robinson, who was a radical disruptor of all the normal English horticultural givens. And she sort of smoothed things out around him, but she did a lot of the donkey work with him and for him. And gradually she went into garden design, and she teamed up with a very well-known architect. And between the two of them, commissioning a house from Edwin Lutyens with a garden by Jekyll was a real mark of having arrived socially. And so her borders, her, what do you call them? Anyway, everything that she did began to get very widely distributed. And she lived until almost 90 years of age, working until almost the very end. It is interesting that her notions of color affected the whole next generation of gardeners. When she was quite old, several people would bring their own children to visit her, to see the garden. And it was sweet because it was sort of a laying on of hands. She would put her hand on the head of this 9-year-old boy or 10-year-old boy and kind of bless him. And a number of them went on to become really famous horticulturists themselves. For example, Graham Stewart Thomas, whom everyone has heard of, a great expert on roses. He had been blessed by Gertrude Jekyll. I could spend the whole talk on Gertrude, but we have to move on. But just to give you the idea how important she is, and now, well, she was regarded, the Royal Horticultural Society awarded her its first Victoria Medal in 1897. The Royal Horticultural Society was not friendly to women. Women were very grudgingly allowed to become what were called fellows, but we would now call members. But they were not invited to the annual dinner. And the secretary himself wanted no part of women of any sort. But even they were obliged to recognize her incredible contributions. And so in 1897, she received the very first Victoria Medal that the Society had ever given out. Not a bad achievement. Here's another one who's very, very important. She's becoming more well-known because a number of scholars are taking more interest in her. She came from a comfortable family, and her father was a prosperous retail chemist. They used to live above the shop, but then he got more and more comfortable, and he bought an estate in Essex and brought up his two daughters in this estate, and they had extensive land. She was incredibly talented, another one who could do anything she wanted very well. She played the violin very well. She was very good at playing tennis. She became fascinated with gardens. And one other fascinating thing about her, that her family had a friend, a wealthy Countess Helen, come to me in a second, who was their godmother, she and her sister. And every year on the birthday of these little girls, she would supply a check for $1,000 each. Now, of course, little girls don't open bank accounts. The father took charge of them, but he was very, very honorable, and he set up separate bank accounts for each daughter. So by the time she was 18 or 20, she was a very, very wealthy young woman, and it was her own money. It wasn't family money, it wasn't her husband's money, it was hers. So she decided she was going to rebuild their garden at Warley Place in Essex, their estate, and make it really elegant. And she turned to the very well-known firm up in York of garden designers and landscape and seeds. And she ordered the materials to create a grotto, a waterfall, and a variety of other wonderful hardscape for this garden. And her father, who was very complacent and very good-natured, said, "That's fine, my dear, but just situate it far enough away from the house so it doesn't annoy me and I don't hear it." He didn't question that she was spending a great deal of that money on this very, very elaborate scheme. She then went on to become a really hands-on gardener. She became an expert, for example, in narcissus. There was nothing she didn't know about narcissus. And the Royal Horticultural Society once again had to sort of stiffen its upper lip and allow her to participate on their small bulb committee, where she dealt with all sorts of well-known people, men, on their own terms, and she gave as good as she got. She became very friendly with another narcissus freak, Reverend Engelhardt. He would spend months and years breeding new narcissus, and his manse at his vicarage. He brought then the more promising ones to her, and she would then give them or put them on trial. It is said that she would take the children of her gardeners, and she had probably 20 gardeners, give them a couple of shillings and tell them to run around the estate and plant the bulbs. And then she would watch over the next year or two which ones succeeded. And the ones that succeeded, she then dug up the bulbs and she would send them into the nurseries to be put them into commerce. So she was very, very active with all this. That wasn't enough for Ellen Wilmot. Ellen Wilmot, the family liked to travel in the south of France for their holidays. And she found a beautiful garden near Aix-en-Provence. And she bought it. She and her sister, using their private money, bought a garden in rural France, where they planted it with roses by the million. Because if you know, Aix-en-Provence is one of the centers of the rose perfuming industry, because roses grow so very well. So now she's got 2 gardens. But then on another trip, she visited Sir Thomas Hanbury, who had this gorgeous tropical, subtropical garden on the Ligurian coast of Italy, the French border up there in the Mediterranean. And she fell in love with that area, and she thought his garden would know. And nothing would do. At least she then bought land a few miles from Hanbury, the Villa Boccanegra. and she created a third garden. So simultaneously, at any one time, this woman owned 3 gardens in 3 separate countries, and she employed probably 120 gardeners. None of them were ever women. Even though Gertrude Jekyll sat on the board of a women's garden school, Ellen Wilmot was not interested in women gardeners. She herself was a consummate gardener. In fact, her hands were completely gnarled and misshapen. And she would get up very early in the morning. She'd be out working, pulling weeds or whatever, before the gardeners came, galumphing in. She was a terrible taskmaster. She was incredibly difficult. Eventually, the sluggish authorities at the Royal Horticultural Society woke up to the fact that they had another star on their hands. So in 1897, together with Gertrude Jekyll, Ellen Wilmot also received the Royal Victoria Medal. But the problem was she didn't show up. And Sandra Lawrence has written a very interesting book about what the reason for that was. And I don't want to take too much more time on one person, but it was a very interesting matter. Okay, now, at the end of the 19th century, there was something called the surplus women problem. Now, you might ask, what is a surplus woman? There are no surplus men. Men always have somewhere to go. They're either in a pub or a library or a coffee shop or somewhere or another. But there was what was considered to be a social problem of surplus women. And once again, this was a subset of women. These were women from upper middle class families, which had very often 8, 10, 12 children, who didn't marry. Either the family wasn't poor enough to give them a dowry or there was some other reason. But there was a huge cadre of women who were too well born to do anything so demeaning as to work. They couldn't serve behind a counter or go into a factory. They had to sort of sit and grin and bear it in a cold, unlighted room, an unheated room, and nurse their chilblains and pray that something good might show up and happen to them. And there were a number of them that it was noticeable. And there were at least 2 women in England, there probably were others, but at least 2, who were very concerned about this, who were very forward-thinking. And they decided that if such women who couldn't do ordinary lower-class work were to learn how to become gardeners, this was a very reputable, respectable profession that would enable them to earn a living. So Frances, Countess of Wolsey, and another one, Daisy, what's not her real name, but she was also Frances, Countess of Warwick, were among the 2 who set out to remedy the problem, and they founded schools of gardening for ladies. In the end, this movement, there were about 19 or 20 of them. They were very small, they could take 10, at the most, maybe 15 women. Most of them took fewer than that. But they were very, very serious. They obtained the syllabus from places like Kew and the Royal Horticultural Society for training gardeners, and they took young women and they taught them how to do this work. And a number of them found jobs. It was very interesting that in the World War I, when the gardeners at Kew were all called up into the army, Sir Ernest Thistleton Dyer was obliged to hire women because he had no alternative. And they did a very, very good job. There's no question that when women turn their hand to something, they do a very good job. Other women in war efforts come to mind, in factories and other places. It was really, it disproved the idea that women were sort of flimsy featherheads, not useful for much beyond having children. So Countess of Wolsey and Countess of Warwick were 2 very important women in this particular movement. In the end, it petered out because of the issues of scale. And in fact, what really helped redeem women or rescue women from this terrible fate of being surplus were the bicycle and the typewriter. She could travel on a bicycle and she could learn to type and do typing. And that was the salvation of women and helped them to become established in the business world. Here's a German lady who had similar notions. I tried very hard in this book not to stick only to Anglophone characters, because that's too narrow. I couldn't, of course, cover the entire world, but you'll find references to women in other countries. Helene Langer was a teacher who observed a similar problem among German women. If anything, with Germany, the social stranglehold on such women was even tighter. And she was a pioneer in women's rights and women's freedom and tried very hard to get women established in the business world. Here's one of my favorites. This rather tough-looking lady is a German dentist, but she had studied dentistry in the United States, in Baltimore to be particular. And she had noticed when she was walking around Baltimore down in the docks, crate upon crate of apples destined to go to Germany. And she thought, this is ridiculous. Germany is a very fertile country, and we can grow our own apples, thank you very much. Well, when she got back to Germany, she bought a house, established her dental practice. She had a very helpful mother who took care of things. And she became active with involved in women's things in Berlin. And she heard about the fact that they were opening schools of gardening in other parts of Germany. She decided to open her own school of gardening. So she's another very important figure. She trained probably 50 or 60 young women who then went on to become professional gardeners. This woman now, we're in America, and this is a very, very important, well-known woman. I'm sure everybody's heard of her. She designed the famous grounds at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington. She was the niece of Edith Wharton, the novelist. This woman came from one of those highly placed New York families, the 400, and had to struggle very hard against the prejudices of her mother and her family. But she wanted to become a landscape designer. And she, because of her social connections, she was able to get to Dr. Sargent, who was the director of the Arnold Arboretum, which is now part of Harvard, apprenticed herself to him and learned the craft and became a very active designer. She was one of the first women landscape designers. She was also one of the very best. She was originally Beatrix Jones, but then she married Dr. Max Ferrand, who became the librarian at the Huntington Gardens and Library in Pasadena in California. And so she moved out there, and she bumped into a very, very difficult man who kind of clipped her wings for a bit. William Herzing was a German. He was the director of that property, and there were thousands of acres. It was a huge, Huntington was a self-made railroad millionaire, and he had this gigantic property. And he wanted no part of some upstart woman calling herself a landscape designer. It made her life a little difficult, but she did manage to survive very well. Now, this is a beautiful shot of a garden in Sonoma County, which is just about 50 miles north here of San Francisco. It was originally a quarry. And it's interesting because the person who bought it, Jane Davenport Jansen, decided that she could turn it into a garden. And it has been a place of pilgrimage ever since. And she had some very, very unusual ideas. She was trained in botany, understood planting. And she decided that she was going to populate her quarry with plants from Asia and the Far East. And she took on a director, a man who would do the day-to-day running, a man called Bill McNamara, another superlative character. And he traveled yearly in the spring to China, to Taiwan, to Japan, to Korea. And then in the fall, to make notes of what he saw. And in the fall, he would return and come back with the seed. So when you visit this lovely place, all those trees and shrubs that you see there were grown from seed 60 or 70 years ago. enormous numbers from China, but from the other countries as well. And it is a unique place. He brought back a lot of species roses. Now, any of you who are rose lovers know that our modern roses are hybrids, very complex hybrids between old Chinas of various species and other kinds of species rose. But the Chinas were extremely important. Now having a source of China's species roses in the United States is going to be even more important than it might have been, say, 30 years ago, as things are going more and more awry between this country and China. Traveling to collect plants in China will become very iffy. So this is probably one of my favorite places, and anybody who comes to San Francisco, I suggest you make an effort and visit this fabulous garden. But it was built and designed by a woman, and she left her money in trust, so it continues to this day. Here's another fabulous North American garden, but this is just up over the border in Canada, in Victoria on Vancouver Island. Bouchard Gardens. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it was created by Mrs. Bouchard. Her husband owned Portland Cement, and he bought this quarry because the earth in the quarry was the ideal basis for Portland Cement. Now, she was a very sophisticated, well-educated woman, and she really didn't like being exiled to the back of beyond and looking out at this ugly quarry. And she had the same idea as Mrs. Jansen. She brought in a garden designer, and famous at the time Japanese garden designer. We're talking about 1900, 1912. So, excuse me, let me just take a sip of water. She planted it, or he designed it for its aesthetic value primarily, rather than the Mrs. Jansen more scientific attitude. But I have been to this garden, and once again, it is breathtaking. It is absolutely breathtaking. This is another American landscape architect. Her fame was because she designed the sets for the amazing film Gone with the Wind. Now I'm talking about some very remarkable English women horticulturists. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of Beth Chatto for her groundbreaking book, The Dry Garden. Beth grew up in a upper working class, lower middle class family. Her father, I think, was a policeman. But she was bright and she was well educated for that era for a woman. And then she wanted to become a teacher, and then she married Alan Chatto. And Alan Chatto owned an orchard and a small nursery in Essex. And he had been a pupil of Karl Förster. Now, Förster was the man in Germany in the early 20th century who came up with the idea that the right plant in the right place requires very little attention. Once you establish the plant where it should be, you can more or less forget it. You don't have to water it, you don't have to pamper it. Alan came back in the early 1930s from Germany with this idea, but then, of course, later in the 1930s, anything to do with Germany was out of the question. But she and he ran their nursery, and that particular part of Essex, the ground is very, very arid. And she came up and she used his thoughts, and she planted plants that would grow very well. And she studied them and she wrote that book. Beth Chatto was a transformative figure in English horticulture and remains famous to this day. Now, here's one of my very favorites, and I'm sorry that I do not know which of these ladies is Sister Mary Xavier, because, as you know, religious orders do not encourage individuality. Somewhere in there is Sister Mary Xavier, and she was a nun in Tasmania, and she was noted for her hobby of crossbreeding roses. Sister Mary became an authority on roses. She won prizes at the rose shows. She became an officer of the Tasmania Rose Society. And amazingly, the Mother Superior was a very broad-minded woman because, as you know, religious sisters are not supposed to be attached to earthly things. But maybe the fact that Sister Mary's roses sold very well and brought in income to the convent may have played a small part in the fact that she was allowed to get on with this for her all her life she was there. They were the Presentation Sisters, are a teaching order, and they ran schools, and she taught at a girls' high school in Hobart. And what is really lovely is that the girls she taught learned how to do the rose breeding and so on, and they formed their own convent rose society, and they adopted all the strict rules of the Hobart and Tasmania Rose Society, and they held a show every year in honor of their teacher. This is probably one of my favorite stories in this entire presentation. Now I'm going to Canada. And Isabella Preston may not be a well-known name to you, but she was very well-known in her day. She was born in Lancashire into a very comfortable family. Her father was a goldsmith, and he had a very big garden at their house, and he grew all their vegetables and flowers. And she was the youngest, so she would trot along behind him, picking up the potatoes and whatever he was doing. And so she learned gardening very, very early. After he died, as a single woman, she could not live on her own. She lived with her married sister, and in about 19, I don't remember, 12 or something, the married sister and her family moved to Ottawa in Canada, where Isabella was then left to find something to do. She had spent at least 1 year at one of those schools that I mentioned earlier. So she had a very good knowledge of technical horticulture. She loved the gardening. She went along to the Canadian agricultural station, which Ottawa is the federal center of Canada, and they maintained a very big agricultural station in order to do research and maintain the health and welfare of the Canadian crops. And they were kind of stumped because they'd never had women working for them, and they didn't really know what to do with her. But she made it very plain to the director at the time, was a man named William McCoon. Any of you ever eat any McCoon apples? They're named for him. And he sort of took pity on her. And he said, well, I'll hire you as a day laborer. They had to write up a new job description. They had to have an active farmer. I don't know. But she was taken on. And then it very quickly appeared that this was no feather-headed woman. This was a powerhouse. And she began crossbreeding lilac and lilies. And there are a whole series of phenomenal lilac and phenomenal lilies bred by Miss Preston. I think I have time to tell you an anecdote about her, which is rather funny. There was an order of monks, a monastery on an island in the Quebec River. No women were ever allowed on the island. They didn't even have female animals. They got their milk and their eggs from somewhere else. No hens, no cows. But they ran into a problem with some other crop. They approached Ottawa and they said, send a consultant. We want to ask this question. So not thinking about it, Ottawa sends her. Well, when she got off the boat, off the ferry, the consternation was palpable. And at least one monk retained the power of speech. The rest simply disappeared. And they very quickly bundled her back on the ferry and sent her. They never even stopped to ask her anything about the problem. I love that story. This is another Canadian lady who also was an immigrant. What's wrong with immigrants, by the way? Felicitas Fieda was Viennese. She had survived both world wars and then gone to Sweden after the Second World War. She was a geneticist by training, but also interested in gardens. And she too presented herself to the Canadian agricultural station in Ottawa. By then, they were not quite as dumbfounded as they were 10 years before with Isabella, and they took her on. And once again, she showed them just how amazing she really was. They asked her to create a line of roses that would tolerate the sub-zero Canadian winters without a lot of extra special coddling or anything. And she developed an incredibly simple but very effective idea. She took a whole series of roses. She planted them out in an open field with no windbreaks, no anything to protect them, and just waited. And I saw what happened, and you need industrial supplies of patience to be a plant breeder. She probably waited 5 years, to see what happened. And of course, 99% of the roses had disappeared, leaving her with just a very small handful of guys that survived. Then she went into high gear working with those, and she introduced these Canadian northern roses. She gave them lovely Canadian names. A very, very interesting and important lady. This lady is here in Oregon, and she's works for a small nursery, did a lot of plant breeding. She's very well known for this podocarpus, which is known as spotty dotty. But her real claim to fame is she has given us many of these fabulous butteras that we have now with such exotic and gorgeous foliage. Janet Egger is one of my favorite people. I think you're getting the idea that I'm fond of plant breeders. I think they're a wonderful set of people, and they don't get very much in the way of recognition. Here's a lady whose photo I couldn't find, but she created the first yellow magnolia. Another immigrant came from East Germany after the war and worked at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. This is the only thing I can find which has got her name on it in any way. But there were no yellow magnolias before Eva Maria got busy. So that's a unique discovery, and she enriched everybody's life. There's one across the road. I'm looking at it as I speak to you. Madame Antoine Maillon. The Maillons were a dynasty of rose breeders in France. The peace rose, which is a universal rose now, available anywhere, was originally a Maillon creation. But then it was done right at the end of the 30s, and the Germans were advancing, and Monsieur Maillon got it sent over to this country, where it went to Conan Pyle, the big rose people in New York, and it was reintroduced after the war as the peace rose, an exquisite rose, which I'm sure almost everybody has seen. His widow, whose nickname was Louisette, went on to breed a number of very fascinating roses, but she was very modest. She didn't want her name attached to any of them. Now, this too is a favorite of mine. We're now in Italy, and another set of women. This is Rita Levi Montalcini. Now, Rita Levi Montalcini was a Jewish doctor who was in Rome during the World War, but managed to hide and spent her time working on the growth factor and won a Nobel Prize. And so at the time, she was very prominent. And the woman who developed these roses named this particular one for her. And that woman was Anna Medici Barney. Now, Mrs. Barney won many, many awards and prizes and trophies. And very importantly, she taught her granddaughter, Beatrice Barney, how to do it. And Beatrice Barney is now the rose breeder for the family firm of Rose Barney in northern Italy. Unbelievably interesting women. I think I've talked about most of the ones who were hands-on, but I want to spend a couple of minutes with another aspect of this, which is that women writers, women novelists, very often use a garden as a sort of accessory character in their books. I wish I could say it's an original idea of mine. It isn't, but it intrigued me. And so I followed down a number of rabbit holes, a number of books. And this woman is probably the one whose book is the most famous. She was known as Elizabeth von Arnhem. She was actually Mary Elizabeth Beecham. She was born in New Zealand and taken to London as a child and never lived in New Zealand again. Her first cousin was a very, very well-known short story writer, Catherine Mansfield. So this was a very talented family. Mary Elizabeth was gifted musician, played the piano beautifully, and she was snapped up by a Prussian Count von Arnhem. He was a real Junker and a male chauvinist pig of the first water. And of course, what happens was, as soon as he married her, he locked her up in stuffy Berlin social connections, and she really suffocated. He didn't, of course, let her play the piano in public anymore. That wasn't suited for a Countess von Arnim. But then she found that he had a property in what was in East Prussia, and now actually it's in Poland, Nachhaida. And she decided that's where she wanted to be. And she took her daughters and she went and camped out in this property. And she saw a very disheveled looking property. But near the house, there was some sort of remnant of the garden. And she decided she was going to, recreate this garden and make it really good. And so she set to do it. He wouldn't give her a penny for it. She had to find the money for it out of her dress allowance. But then she finally wrote this book called Elizabeth and Her German Garden. And once again, this is a very, very well-known book, which has survived now. We're talking, 150 years, still around, and which the garden is essentially the main character. And so I find that fascinating enough. In the book, if you're interested, that's the last chapter, number of women where the garden has become a character. Thank you, Noel.
Thank you, Judith. That was fantastic. Really interesting. Gosh, so
absolutely
many
fantastic.
fascinating people to kind of catch up on, actually, and a lot of names I hadn't heard of. So no, really exciting.
Really wonderful, Judith. Thank you. And interesting about breeding plants. I was doing research on scent, and I talked to Michael Marriott and I talked to Robert Vernon of Bluebell Nursery. And they both had a theory, really independently, that if more women were involved with plant breeding, scent would have been more at the top of the priority list. But, because plant breeding is predominantly male in this country anyway, that, scent is very low on the list. So it's quite interesting, actually, looking at your plant breeders.
It's very fascinating. I didn't, of course, give you everybody. The book has a whole chapter on them. But I did speak to a number of contemporary women, like that Janet Egger with the Hooters and a few of them were actually very hesitant to speak to me, were nervous and didn't want their employers to know they'd been speaking to me.
Wow.
Really?
They live on a knife edge. I was able to get a photograph of a couple of them in the book.
Yes.
Put the photographs here because I didn't think they'd want their pictures out in the web. But yes, they walk on a knife edge. They're still not one of the boys yet. So
even now, that's mad. Yeah.
He's got to go and talk to those employers.
Yes. Yes. And another woman came to mind as you were speaking, and that was Susan Jellicoe, Geoffrey Jellicoe's wife.
Oh, yeah. Yes,
because of course, she did his planting schemes, and I certainly don't want to take anything away from Jellicoe's brilliance, but this was a woman behind a man who got all the accolades, really. How often does that happen? But yeah, interesting. Yes, yeah.
I don't want to sound like a shrieking feminist, but
that's all right. You're allowed to.
One person I didn't talk about, if we have 2 or 3 seconds, might be fun for your audience, and that is Vita Sackville-West.
Right. Yes.
Because women garden writers are another interesting subset. But in the 20th century, the world sat back with its mouth open, its tongue hanging out, watching Vita go from one sexual scandal to another, all the time, reading her columns in the Sunday Observer. And then she goes and builds, what's its name, the castle in
Sissinghurst. Yes, yeah.
Which is another place of pilgrimage. But one of the reasons I want to mention her at this moment is that she admitted that her ideas came from Gertrude Jekyll. She said, the most famous thing about Sissinghurst is the White Garden. That was Gertrude Jekyll's idea.
Yeah. Interesting, very interesting. I don't know if we've got any questions. Have we? We've got a couple of Adam saying really enjoyed. I'm looking forward to reading the book, which actually I have a question. How do people buy the book? Where can they buy it?
It should be on Amazon. You have to be a little patient in finding it, but it is there. If you put it M. Taylor, you're more likely to pop it. But
okay, yeah.
It's there. It's titled Women in Gardens.
Right.
That's where it is. It's today, the 10th. I think it officially comes out on the 15th. Some nonsense.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so Amazon or its alternatives, hopefully.
Yes.
And
Yes.
just a little reminder, in fact, in a few weeks' time, May the 1st, we've got, make sure I get her name right, Carol Michel talking about the lost ladies of garden writing. So, so we will continue the theme.
Yes. Yes.
A lot of them. Louise Wild Beaver, American women, English women. It was a very interesting and important role they played in gardening to a lot of women who might otherwise not have thought of doing it.
Yeah. No, absolutely fascinating. And I do love the way in your book that you do go from, you know, garden writing and garden creators and plant breeders. So you're looking across the spectrum rather than just, you know, people who had gardens and created gardens or were designers. So that's fascinating to look at the spectrum and education of women as well in gardening.
To me, gardening is only part of the entire spectrum of horticulture. And the really key thing was that women went from domesticity, forced domesticity, at the end of the 19th and to the early 20th, began to enter the business world. And I attribute that to the uniting that they did, the organizing that they did to get the vote. Women were little islands scattered around, men had societies and institutions. You could even dismiss women because of one woman at a time is nothing. But once they began organizing in the 1840s to get the vote, a great many other benefits followed. One of them was the fact that if they presented a united phalanx, they could enter a profession. And to me, that was part of the story. It was no longer just gardening, but it was horticulture.
Right. I noticed that you didn't include Mien Rouse, the Dutch designer and plantswoman. Is there a particular reason? Did you just have too many more obscure people to get in the book?
Yes, couldn't take everybody.
Couldn't get everybody in. We'll have to write another one.
A lot of other. I have a book on women landscape designers. Somebody wrote a very lovely book about 20 years ago. There are, of course, many others, but I just did what I could at the time.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, what a wonderful presentation and what a wonderful book.
Really interesting. Really interesting.
Yes. And Sister Mary Xavier. Wow, you know, that's fantastic. What a story. Absolutely brilliant.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I shall look forward to reading that properly rather than skimming through. Thank you very much, Judith, and good luck with your next project. May there be more.
Thank you, Judith. It's been lovely having you on, and have a fantastic day in sunny California.
Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And good luck with the book. Good luck with the book.
Make sure I'm on your mailing list. I want to know about that next meeting on May the 1st.
Right, we'll send you. Yeah, we'll keep you up to date.
Very good.
All the best. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.